There's no turning back technology. There's no turning back. You can try to stifle it. It'll just move somewhere else. At last now, I think we've got the willpower to be the leader in this. And I truly think the United States, with our aspirational society, is going to jump into the fray here. And if you're young and looking for somewhere to build a career, I think in digital finance of the 21st century is exactly the place to do so. So I wish you the best, and let's go.
Welcome everyone. This is Mariusz Konieczny. Today I have a special guest, Chris Giancarlo, a former CFTC chairman and senior counsel at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. Chris, thank you very much for joining me.
It's really good to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
You call yourself crypto dad. You wrote a book about that topic. You're very passionate about this topic. You think that crypto is one of the ways or the only way for the government to fix its fiscal house. So let's talk about it.
Well, let me start with saying crypto dad is a name that I'm very proud to have been given as opposed to have selected for myself. It came in early of the year 2018 when I testified before the Senate Banking Committee, and I urged them to treat crypto not with disdain and derision, but actually with respect, and to recognize that there was a new generation behind it, and one that would benefit from sound policy making and sound rulemaking, and the proper attention it deserves. And it's took a long while for that approach to settle in, but I think we really do now see our policymakers in Washington, whether in the legislative branch in Congress, passing things like the Genius Act and working on the Clarity Act, or whether we see regulators at the SEC finally and the CFTC for a long time now making good policy for crypto. So I'm pleased. I'm honored to be given that name by the crypto sphere, and I seek to use that title to advocate, as I have been for now almost 10 years, for sound policy making here in the United States and abroad for crypto. On your second point about crypto as a catalyst for economic growth, in my conversations with the new administration, it's not just crypto; it's all forms of technology, whether it be artificial intelligence or biotechnology, nanotechnology, drone technology, aerospace technology, all of the above. But they do believe that the only way out of our mountain of debt is, as the saying goes, the only way out is through. The only way out of that mountain of debt is to get back to sustained, long-term, sound 3.5% to 4% or more economic growth as the way out. And there's historical examples of this. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, Britain's debt to GDP ratio was something like 4-1, and they looked to be on the heap of history's bankruptcy list until a new technology came around, the steam engine, which Britain very much mastered. And by the 1870s, Britain was one of the richest nations on earth. There's no reason why the United States can't harness new technologies for growth. And it's not a secret that our existing banking system is filled with rent collecting activities, filled with inefficiencies that hold us back from seeing a real type of capital formation efficiencies that are necessary for economic growth. So I do believe, and I share the view, that crypto is one area where the United States could take a global leadership role, and that leadership role will reward leadership with strong economic growth, which could contribute, along with a lot of other factors, with helping us to work through the mountain of debt that we've accumulated over the last few decades.
But how exactly would crypto help solve the fiscal problem or the mountain of debt? Would the government put, let's say, crypto or Bitcoin on the balance sheet? How would this work?
Well, let's just take payments, for example. It's been estimated that the cost of moving money around the globe costs the world between 1 to 2% of its GDP every year just to move money around the globe. Well, it used to be expensive to move other data around the world, but the internet changed all that. Today, the cost of sending a photograph around the world is virtually nothing, and we do it all the time, and we do it in seconds, and we do it 7 days a week, 365. Money at the end of the day is data, and why can't we move money around the world with the same cost efficiencies? In fact, if we could claw back that 1 to 2% of the world's GDP just spent on moving money, that could turbocharge a lot of economies. That could help in a lot of ways. We've had a stalled IPO market, which is one of the main aspirational methods for innovators and founders to realize their dreams and the solutions that they come up with for a lot of commercial needs in our economy. And so, getting back to a type of healthy growth, and if we can think about moving securities offerings onto chain on chain, the efficiencies that will come from that, not just for investors, but for issuers. Imagine if you're a public company for the first time, you might actually know who all your shareholders are in a way that issuers today don't. So crypto is going to add a lot of efficiencies to the economy, whether it's in payments, whether it's going to build in building entirely new infrastructures, whether it's going to be in the way we hold and record securities, whether that be debt securities or equity securities. I'm a believer that within a decade, virtually every securities offering will be on chain and tokenized, and the ones that aren't will trade at a discount to the ones that are.
So
Crypto
you
is
mean you
more
mean
than
you
just
mean that
some.
like you mean that like a publicly traded stocks you would buy a share kind of like you would buy crypto token?
Exactly, exactly, and all the rights and privileges would be part of that token, and the disclosure can accompany that token as well. It would give a degree of efficiency in stock markets. The dirty little secret is most public companies don't know who anywhere between 10 to 20% of their shareholders are, because those shares are in street name and they're held by custodians. And what is a very inefficient system. And crypto is going to provide both. There's going to be both a bottom up demand for tokenized securities, but there's going to be a top-down supply side desire to do this. You're going to have issuers wanting to do securities in tokenized form.
You
Crypto
know,
is more than just a funky new asset class. Crypto is really a whole new architecture of finance. It's an internet-based architecture of finance. The earlier wave of the internet, the one we're all familiar with, the internet of information, was all about computers talking to each other. Well, now we're on the verge of a new wave of the internet. It's no longer about computers talking to each other. It's about computers transacting with each other. And they're going to do that in the form of digital tokens. Computers are not going to contact your bank to make payments to another computer. They're going to find direct means through tokenized units of value to pay for things, whether those are stable coins, which are basically tokens pegged to the dollar, or other forms of digitized value tokens. So that's the future of the 21st century.
it's interesting that you're talking about the inefficiencies of the markets, the IPOs, moving the money around. I'm not sure if you are aware of this, and I'd like to get your take on it. So I personally, I'm involved in a lot of microcap stocks, venture stocks, and because the US doesn't have a venture exchange, a lot of these companies have to trade either on Toronto Stock Exchange Venture or Canadian Securities Exchange or over the counter. And I found that it is such a nightmare for these companies to raise money. So for example, if I'm in the US and I participate in a private placement, I directly wire them the money, which in itself is a nightmare to wire this
Nightmare.
money, nightmare to the company. But then after I receive those shares in a DRS form or a share certificate, many times because I'm in the US, I can't deposit those shares in my brokerage account. The rules change every 3 months. One time, the stock has to be over $1 or over 50 cents. And it's a disaster for these companies, because if I, as a shareholder, finance them and I cannot deposit this and have liquidity to maybe participate in the second private placement, these companies are starved out of capital.
Yeah. Well, so there's a number of your frustration is built on a number of elements. One is our securities markets, and unfortunately, the leadership of the SEC have made it this way, and their oversight committees in Congress has been skewed toward people that are so-called accredited investors, basically wealthy or otherwise highly knowledgeable people. And so some of the best opportunities in our securities markets have been blocked away from ordinary people and reserved for the most privileged in society. That needs to change, and that's certainly on the agenda of the new SEC leadership. That needs to change. Secondly, your frustration with the banking system. First of all, why are banks the exclusive guardians of payments? Why can't this be done as a technology transaction as opposed to a bank transaction? Well, that's what crypto in many ways is about. I'll tell you just an anecdote. I've got a cousin who lives in a suburb of Cincinnati who banks with a community bank and wanted to send a wire transfer out from the United States to the UK. And when he called the bank to make the transaction, the bank said, "Our person who does wire transfers is out sick today. Call back tomorrow." I mean, it's laughable. But that's still very much the case in too much of the banking system. That's going to change and change dramatically in the coming decade. Moving money is going to be almost as simple as moving other data through the internet, and that change is coming, and that change is coming fast. And the proponents of the existing status quo are going to be finding it harder and harder to resist that change.
Mm-hmm. And so, when it comes to crypto, how how did you start getting involved in that space? Did you discover Bitcoin early on? Did you buy Bitcoin yourself? Walk us through the history of how you got into this space and became so passionate about it.
So before I served as a government regulator, I spent 30 years in the private sector, half of that time as a practicing lawyer in New York and London, and then the other half as an entrepreneur. In the year 2000, I teamed up with a group of other fellow-minded entrepreneurs, and we built one of the world's largest global trading platforms for complex over-the-counter products that are traded bank to bank. We didn't trade. We were not a trading house. We were an execution platform that allowed these large financial institutions to trade amongst themselves. And one of the products that we were very active in is a product called credit default swaps. In 2008, as the financial crisis was unfolding, we found ourselves right in the center of that market for credit default swaps that some people have claimed to be at the center of the storm. The fact of the matter is, it wasn't the fear that credit default swaps would fail. It was the fear that they would work and that banks that had exposures to each other would have to pay out on those exposures. At the time that Lehman Brothers collapsed, the Federal Reserve estimated that there was $400 billion in credit default swap protection written by the other Wall Street banks against the failure of Lehman Brothers. In other words, they believed that if Lehman Brothers fell, the rest of Wall Street would have had to pay out $400 billion in effectively insurance against that failure. And they extrapolated that number to say, well, if Lehman's failure would cost $400 billion to the other banks, a failure of Morgan Stanley would cost $800 billion to the other banks, and a failure of JP Morgan would cost over, $1.5 trillion of payouts to the other banks. We can't let this contagion to rage. So what we've got to do is stuff all the banks' balance sheets with cash, known as the Troubled Asset Relief Program, in the same way their fire brigade wets down the houses around the one that's on fire so the other houses don't go up in fire. Well, that number to me struck me. I was in communications with the Federal Reserve throughout the crisis as the leader of external relations for our firm and as the head of our industry trade association. And I knew from our activity on the trading floor that every time one bank wrote such protection against the failure of another bank, they would turn around and re-hedge the position. So if they believe that the total amount paid out on a failure of Lehman Brothers was 400 billion, I believe that the net amount was much less than that. But I didn't know the exact. In fact, nobody knew the exact amount, and that's why we had a panic in the market, because nobody knew the exact fallout. Well, later on, I read the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper, and it proposed that if all these swaps were written on a blockchain, we would have known the net figure. And in fact, because of work done by Professor Bruce Tuckman, who subsequently worked for me at the CFTC as our chief economist, we now know that a failure of Lehman Brothers would have not required a payout of 400 billion. It would have not been 200 billion. It would have not been 80 billion. It would have been less than $8 billion because of all the rehedging that was done. Well, we didn't know that in 2008. It's the reason we had a financial crisis. But if we knew that, policymakers would have had a lot of different choices. They could have let Lehman fail. They could have let it been bought. They could have let it been bought out. They didn't have those choices because they didn't have the visibility. And that's when I became a believer in the blockchain, because if we had a blockchain, if all those swaps were written on a blockchain in 2008, we would have known in real time, and perhaps we might not have had a financial crisis. So when President Obama asked me to join the CFTC, nominated me to join as a commissioner in 2014, I became very active in this area, followed it closely, spoke about it publicly, and joined with my fellow commissioners in 2015 to declare Bitcoin the world's first digital commodity, and therefore under the supervision of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And in 2017, when I was named chairman of the agency, I immediately set out to make the agency the lead agency on everything having to do with digital commodities. We were the first to create a dedicated resource center in the federal government for financial markets and digital commodities under the leadership of our first chief innovation officer, Daniel Gorfine. And then we greenlighted the launch of Bitcoin futures at the end of 2017. We were very conscious that one of the reasons why the dollar is the world's reserve currency is because most of the world's physical commodities are priced in dollars. And they're priced in dollars not in the spot market. The oil's not priced in dollars at the gas tank, and gold's not priced at the jewelry store. It's actually priced in the derivative markets, in the futures markets that are priced in dollars. And so we wanted to make sure that Bitcoin, as the world's first digital commodity, would also be priced in dollars. And we greenlighted our great U.S. Commodity derivatives exchanges like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange to launch the world's first regulated market for digital commodities and Bitcoin futures, and eventually Ethereum futures and XRP futures and others. And today, those markets that we started back in 2017 are deep, and they're liquid, and they're transparent, and they're remarkably free of fraud and manipulation, thanks to the really sound supervision by the U.S. Commodity Futures Exchange and some of the self-regulatory organizations. And it was not long after that I was called to testify before the Senate Banking Committee about those choices we made to launch those derivative markets in digital commodities. There were a number of critics of that decision who felt we were legitimizing Bitcoin. My feeling was it was for Congress to either legitimize it or outlaw it. As long as a legal product, our job was to put a regulatory structure around it, which we did. And it was at that hearing that I actually advocated for Congress to step up to the plate and deliver sound regulatory frameworks. And that's where I earned the nickname Crypto Dad. But that's how I came down the proverbial crypto rabbit hole. And today I see crypto as much more than just some exciting new investment opportunity. It's really much more about a whole new architecture for finance, an architecture that's less about writing liabilities on bank balance sheets. It's more about recording the ownership of things of value on the internet and through various digital networks of value.
So Crypto Dad, you wrote a book, Crypto Dad, The Fight for the Future of Money, right?
That's exactly right. Yes.
So tell us a bit, what is this book about?
So, it's funny when you've lived through history, it's important to record what you saw and how it happened so that the story is captured forever and not lost. The launch of Bitcoin futures, the whole approach to crypto a decade ago is a unique story that I felt needed to be told, and the decisions we made at the CFTC, which are now today taken for granted. But back then, there was enormous opposition across the political spectrum. There was no divide as there is today between the political parties on this. All of what we're seeing today, Congress stepping up to the plate to write the type of regulation that we begged them for 8 years ago, is the story that I tell in Crypto Dead. But more than that, I go on to take a look at where digital assets are going, and my belief, as I've said, that crypto is more than just a funky new asset class. It's really a whole new architecture of finance, and it's going to transform everything we know about how we record who owns what and who transfers what to whom. And as I said, the first wave of the internet back in the 1990s was about computers talking to each other. And that simple expression, computers talking to each other, has led to all kinds of social innovations from digital social networks like Facebook and media networks like YouTube and TikTok and music networks and otherwise. It's changed the way we as a society gather information, share information. Just look at the impact of X and other social networks on many countries around the world, and the so-called color revolutions that Emily Parker writes about in her book on those color revolutions, the role that social media has played. Well, now we're going into a new evolution. We're going beyond computers talking to each other. We're now going into an era of computers transacting with each other increasingly. As we also embark upon artificial intelligence, we are going to program our devices to transact with other devices directly, efficiently, and the inefficiencies in the current bank system, where bank wires can only be sent when the person that handles the wire is not at home sick but is in the office, it's just it's just that's just archaic. Our devices are going to need to be able to transact 24/7, 365 with immediate settlement and recovery, and the process of payments is going to shift from being the prerogative of banks to being the prerogative of tech companies, and we're gonna want our devices to immediately uh, conduct connectivity. I mean, just imagine a future not far off when you're going to be in your self-driving car and you're going to speak to the car's AI interface and tell it that you want to direct to the nearest Starbucks because you want a latte and you want the car's computer to pay Starbucks computer for that latte, and all you want to do is have your self-driving car pull up to the window and they'll hand you the drink. It's paid for, it's been transacted and navigated, and that's going to be the future and not far off. And nobody's going to have time in that future to pull out a credit card and pay some bank for the privilege of 3 or 4% of the cost of the coffee to pay for it. AI devices, when they scrape data in the future from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, are going to pay the Times in nanobytes of terabytes of information, and that's not going to go through some bank's credit card processing service. That's going to be done in micro fractions of a penny, automated in an automated fashion, computer to computer. It just as it was back in the 1990s, hard to envision things like Amazon.com or YouTube or Facebook or X or Uber for that matter. It's hard to imagine all of the outcomes of computers talking to each other, but that's our digital future. That's what's coming, and I'm delighted that at last we have a government administration in the United States that is opening the doors to this innovation rather than trying to shut it down or stifle it. as was done over the last 4 years.
Okay, my final question is, do you have any concluding comments for my audience?
Put your seatbelts on, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, it's going to be a very, very exciting future. And for young people, I think the career opportunities in building this infrastructure, creating the social impact that this is going to have is going to be very, very exciting. I've been in public life now 40 years, and you know, if I can get jazzed up about this, well, if you're just starting on your career, you ought to be totally excited about this and ready to get involved. There's no, you know, there's no turning back technology. There's no turning back. You can try to stifle it. It'll just move somewhere else. At last now, I think we've got the willpower to be the leader in this. And I truly think the United States, with our aspirational society, is going to jump into the fray here. And if you're young and looking for somewhere to build a career, I think in digital finance of the 21st century is exactly the place to do so. So I wish you the best, and let's go.